Coming up next on the SPNN Forum, we have Keith Baker, Executive Director of Reconnect Rondo. Hi, I'm Martin Ludden, Executive Director of St. Paul Neighborhood Network, and we are here live in the Kwame McDonald studio at SPNN with Mr. Keith Baker, Executive Director of Reconnect Rondo. Keith, welcome to the forum.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
It's nice to have you. So this Reconnect Rondo is a big, exciting project. Can you tell us a little bit about just kind of the broad strokes of what it is and what it means?
Sure. Well, I mean, in Minnesota, we have many, many things called a land bridge. In Duluth, the Rose Garden, or Lowry Tunnel. So really, when we're talking about just basically a structure where a community can be connected, upwards of 21 acres of new land created over the freeway to reignite an African American cultural enterprise district, and that was what Rondo was back in the 50s.
Yeah. So we're talking about putting a new structure over Interstate 94. Between what and what?
Well, in the area of Lexington and Dale, but more specifically Grotto and Chadsworth. And
so this is going to create 21 acres, which when you said that, like, that's a good chunk of land.
I mean, it really is a pretty significant chunk of land. It allows for upwards of 13 acres of new open park space, just as one illustration, the potential of 576 housing units, a business incubation center, possibly an outdoor botanical garden, who knows? So there are a lot of possibilities that can go on top of 21 acres.
Yeah, and it's, you hear those numbers and, in a place where we have some significant disparities economically between white communities and African American communities, when we have clearly a housing shortage in St. Paul, like those kind of projects, those kind of numbers sound like a good thing for what we're doing.
I mean, absolutely. If you just imagine, Rondo ranks net negative by every measure, and we've got about 18 measures, from financial security, housing security, environmental security. I mean, you just name those measures. It's a pretty diverse community today, so we have to really keep that in mind, even though the aim is focused in on African Americans principally being the drivers and the direct beneficiaries in terms of descendants or elders that lost more directly. This is really about a larger prosperity opportunity, I think, for a broader community.
And, a rising tide will hopefully lift all boats.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's start, I want to come back to some of those more specific outcomes, but what needs to happen? Because, right now, as you drive down 94, if you're going, east from here, you're going to see a nice brand new bridge at Dale, and you're going to see a lot of concrete and a lot of, grass on the sides. Like, what happens between now and that?
Yes, we were so pleased to get 6.2 million from the legislature, which allows us to do the pre-planning work. And pre-planning really is kind of the igniter of studies that are dealing with anti-displacement, just as an example, or restorative development, or even those things called master planning. And it's just where the ideas have generated. So if we give everybody a blank sheet of paper, just as an example, and we ask them to sketch out the various things that they aspire for this to be about, then that's the process we're in right now. It's just the input of ideas, the buy-in of community overall, the envisioning. So that's where we are right now with that 6.2 million.
So who's sketching on paper right now? Who's giving you that input to say, this is what I want to see in this new thing?
Right. So this summer was the first real launch post-COVID. So we were able to really engage with people more directly. So we've probably engaged with upwards of 2,000 individuals, 2,000 conversations. We did have a culmination August 25th of about 150 folks from the community gathering, thinking about and learning about master planning. And so that's where the input point really happens. So it's a combination of elders, descendants, as well as the broader residents within the St. Paul community providing that input.
And when you say elders and descendants, you're talking about folks who actually grew up in Rondo pre-94?
Absolutely.
Not 1994, but pre-Interstate 94.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
so it's a wide range of folks. So not only are we talking about really direct, literally people that were in a place and time when the freeway came through, but also those that felt the residual effects after even people moved out of the area. So the descendants, and then you have those that have been in the community, either moved into the community after the freeway came through. So there's a lot of investment when it's all said and done within the African American community.
Right on. And that kind of master planning, I know that is a process. Like there's a book on how to do master planning.
Sure.
What does it look like for this project?
Well, first of all, we had to put together a technical team, a team of really capable folks, and I'm really happy to mention that the lead master planner, technical person, really grew up in Rondo. His family is from Rondo.
Perfect.
So we try to find those kinds of levels of expertise because it's a lot easier for people to connect up and understand how important it is for community input when it's all said and done. So the next 12, 24 months, that's the input process. We began to think about, okay, what are the aspirations? What are the outcomes that people are ultimately looking for? Trying to get the community to own the process.
Right.
The technical team is just like a box of crayons. And we're asking the community to say, well, how do you want to use these box of crayons? They bring into the table certain expertise. And so we're going to help you understand what that really means, how that applies to ultimately putting forward a vision for the area. So it's the taste, the smell, the feel, the sight of the environment itself, really reflecting those voices and the outcomes that people are talking about.
Yeah. Is this something, so talk a little bit about kind of the genesis of this idea. You talked about other land bridges, like in Duluth and stuff, but are there other like freeway coverings with development, or is this a completely new project?
Well, in Ohio, there's a pretty interesting one we use as our case study because it has established on either side of a structure a business corridor.
Okay.
So that's one example. But again, it's not point center on the freeway, but it kind of creates at least a framework for a roadway, if you will. But when it comes to the proposition we're talking about, it's pretty new. Clyde Warren Bridge in Dallas, Texas. It has a restaurant on it. It has an outdoor amphitheater. So that's an illustration of the fact that some people have considered this. But in terms of literally bringing 576 housing units, or literally creating 13 acres of new land, or literally creating civic common space or business incubation space, no, we're leading, I think, the pack on those kinds of conversations.
So how does that impact the process? Because if you're doing a process for a community park, there's a playbook there. Like like I said, there's a book on master planning, I'm sure. How is that affecting how you're going forward? Because it really is pretty much a blank slate.
Yeah, I mean, I probably speak about it more simply than it is, for sure. Because we have to recognize there is a process that really is the responsibility of the Department of Transportation. Okay, and then you've got your jurisdictions. You've got your city, county, Met Council, et cetera, all weighing in one form or another. Right. The great thing about this project and what makes it extraordinarily unique, besides the fact we want to put something on top of it, right, is the fact that this is literally being driven by a nonprofit organization on behalf of a community, right? These are folks that are descendants that serve on my board, Mr. Anderson being my board chair. But the genesis of the idea, which I think is really important, surfaced in 2009 when the Central Light Rail Corridor was coming through on University Avenue. There were no stops planned along the Rondo corridor. So what we really feel we've done is taken a look at all of that historical framework and then just simply pulled the drawstring through it all to really imagine the idea that came up in 2009, the idea of a cap or a covering, to now to the point where we are right now thinking about this African American Cultural Enterprise District.
And when you think about large development projects, the other thing that just came to mind for me is, as a nonprofit pushing this project, we look at the Ford site, for example, and that was a chunk of land owned by a private company.
Correct.
Who sold to a private company.
Correct.
and then developed for a profit.
Sure.
You know, so like in this case, like there's no owner per se. I mean, it's a freeway,
Right.
but there's no owner of this land that you're hoping to develop because
Right.
you're going to create the land.
Right, and this is the opportunity for the city
Yeah.
of St. Paul, for the state of Minnesota, quite frankly, is
Yeah.
how do you leverage transportation opportunities or space
Right.
for development? Now, that's not even unique. When we think about Target Field, Target Field sits over the freeway. There's
Yeah.
there's a ballpark authority that has a relationship with the state of Minnesota, okay? And it's that lease agreement
Right.
that allows for them to be responsible for the airspace. So we see this project being really no different,
Right.
is creating mechanisms that would allow for the community to be the master planner, the developer, and when we think about development, we say, okay, so who's the primary, secondary, or tertiary beneficiary?
Right.
In this instance, we believe the community ought to be the primary beneficiary. So we're leveraging the same tools that private development use,
Yep.
the same what we call special purpose financing vehicles, Ballpark Authority, Sports Facilities Authority,
Yeah.
DMC in Rochester,
Right.
but we're using those things in a way that allows for the community actually to get the return
Yeah.
in some form,
Right.
and that return then addressing community needs.
Right. As opposed to, all credit to Ryan and the folks who have been working so hard on
Sure.
that development.
Sure.
That is going, like, the community is in that list of stakeholders.
Sure.
But, they still got to make money on it. So
Right.
that's going to be number one.
I mean, I think that sometimes, I often talk about systems, processes, tools, and resources. They function the same regardless of who's using them.
Right.
For us, we say, how do we use those systems, processes, tools, and resources in the same way that a private developer would use them? And we designed this financing mechanism. It's called 4P. We're accustomed to thinking about 3P, public-private partnerships.
Yep.
In our instance, it's public, private, philanthropic, and people. How do people play into the equation, and how does the return go back in to where communities are extraordinarily invested?
Yeah. I mean, that makes good sense.
We hope so.
You've got me on. So you're talking about kind of these returns to community, hopeful outcomes. Are there things that are bubbling up from those master planning kind of blank slate sketching sessions that
Right.
are, I think, that you would see as probable or likely, outcomes of the project? Like, what are you looking at more specifically for the outcomes?
Yeah, there are, things like housing in the way of outcomes. There are things like business, economic development, areas that are around sustainability and environmental issues, things around culture, art, and history, things that are centered on open and park spaces. So what we're in the early process of doing is saying, if you were to rank them,
Right.
okay, how would you rank them? And we're finding housing,
Yeah.
economic development, cultural, arts, history, okay, and then the third, open park space. Those are the top four of 6 so far. So we'll
Okay.
continue that process
Yeah.
and refine the questions associated with that with the community itself.
Cool. What kind of housing are you looking? Is this single family housing? Is this multi-unit townhomes? Are you not there yet? Like,
Community hasn't told us yet,
Right.
right? So that's part of the ownership.
Yeah.
When it's all said and done, what does the community envision? What is it actually looking for in the way of outcomes? And then it's our job to take that in and say, here's some ideas.
Right. Yeah. And so then you'll be working with, housing partners, I'm sure, to do some of that development and visioning as well.
Absolutely, and we really want to put front and center also, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, businesses that don't ordinarily find themselves in lead positions,
Right.
but are laggers in terms of participation. And so if we really put that center, we're also building capacity and economic development among the ecosystem itself.
You talk about those folks not being kind of in the fore of processes like this, and is that for lack of desire to participate, or is it for lack of an invite?
That's really a good question. I mean, I would probably say it's all of the above that are part of the dynamic. I think, having been in the Twin Cities for some 40 years, been responsible for looking at procurement, been responsible for, even overseeing federal regulations around procurement, those kinds of things. When we think about private development is using public tools, but there's no expectation in those public tools necessarily that a goal be set or participation happen. It's usually a relationship-driven kind of development project.
Yeah.
On the example of the Sports Facilities Authority, just as a whole different picture, there are obligations because it's a public, quasi-public entity, okay? And so therefore, the expectations for participation happens.
Right.
So it is really situational. I think we can do a better job than what we're doing right now, but certainly we think that we can set even innovative models on this project to ensure that kind of inclusion happens.
Well, and it's one thing to, set a forum and have people, expect people to show up. And it's another entirely to invite specific people to show up.
Sure.
And to have that, to really kind of drive your feedback in that intentional way.
Oh,
which
absolutely.
is what it sounds like you're doing.
Oh, I mean, the whole project is intended to really allow for communities to lead, those that historically have been impacted by things like an interstate to lead. But if we're going to all prosper in the state of Minnesota, then it's important that we are intentional about creating where those avenues and opportunities exist.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You talked about being here in the Twin Cities for 40 years. Yeah. What? I have also been in the Twin Cities for 40 years, but what brings you to this project? What's your what does it hit for you?
There's no straight line, I'm just going to tell you.
There never is.
It goes all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, I spent 18 years for the Department of Transportation.
Okay.
From about 1997 to the time that I left in 2015.
State or federal?
State.
Okay.
And prior to that, though, I spent 10 years volunteering with the United Way system, learning how monies are distributed, decision-making, program evaluation, all those kinds of things. Yeah. And so it's with that background and my curiosity about how systems work, how distribution happens, how decisions are happening, no different than when I worked for the Department of Transportation. How do projects come together? How does the funding come together? All those kinds of things. Right. So I probably would say this is kind of like a capstone for me, where the drawstring of a wide range of things, including youth development work and education work. This project, I think, sets the conditions for us to kind of look at, post-George Floyd, how systems, processes, tools, and function, and how to really take a look at an opportunity to really address some really systemic disparities that exist in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah. And I think you said that's not a straight line. I think that is actually a pretty straight line. It's the stuff that you're talking about, working on and being curious about those are all things that you're going to need to pull this project through. And the systems side of it, with examination, it should make sense that if this is the system we have,
right,
and these are the inputs to the system,
right,
the outputs should not be a surprise.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Just again, if we just think about systems, processes, tools, and resources, I can't emphasize that enough, okay? They exist.
Right.
They function. Now, they haven't functioned necessarily always to the benefit of community members.
Right.
Okay? So then the question is, well, how do we make decisions with these same systems a little bit differently and leverage them with intentionality towards community benefit?
Yeah.
We have an ecosystem, a nonprofit ecosystem, that is responding, driven by missions. We have a philanthropic environment that is driven by missions. Yeah. But what I can say in my experience in 40 years, I'll go 30 years more directly, right? I've not seen scalable change take place in any geographic area in the state of Minnesota and the Twin Cities. Not over north, not over in Rondo. We don't see scalable change. We see celebrations of incremental success, right? But no geographic change with sustainability. So this project, while people are focused in on the land bridge, it's really about how do you transform a geographic space leveraging a transportation element, right? And how do you help incentivize or align missions of nonprofit organizations in the ecosystem, okay, in a common direction around housing,
Right.
around economic development, around workforce pathways, about business incubation.
Yeah.
I mean, we can go on. So it gives us a tremendous opportunity to influence a larger, amplify the ecosystem, figure out how to resource the ecosystem, leveraging transportation investment.
Yeah. And I'd argue, I mean, the systems you're talking about, I think are producing what they were designed to produce.
Okay.
So I think in your spot, you're creating a new system, right? Or doing it differently. Because I
Right.
think, the outputs that we're getting from those systems are not to the benefit of the community, but I'm not sure they were meant to be.
Well, if we were, that's really, really important, really important notation. And that's the point, though we talk about it as if it's designed to.
Right.
But let's just be driven by the data by itself. Forget our emotion around it. Let's just look at the data.
Right.
And the data says Rondo ranks net negative by every measure, 18 of them, okay, post the freeway coming through.
Right.
And if Rondo had been left to its own devices, right, current property value collectively of the 700 homes that were taken would be $157 million by itself, just leaving the homes there.
Yeah.
Right? So you can see the gutting of the potential future, right? So recognizing that we're addressing a past wrong, we have a very diverse community, so we must really consider lifting and celebrating the diverse community, but setting conditions for the future, for residual, to deal with those extraordinary disparities that exist in the geographic space.
Yeah. I can't think of a better way to close this conversation than what you just said. So where can folks get more information if they're wanting to learn more about Reconnect Rondo?
Right, reconnectrondo.com.
Okay.
You'll find a floating tab that invites you to get involved. We really invite folks to do what they can to learn about the project. We've done technical studies, feasibility studies. We see this as a technical case being made, a business case being made, a moral case, and a just case. So reconnectrondo.com. We're on social media, so you'll find us in a wide range of avenues in that way as well.
Nice. Keith, thank you for your time. Thanks for your work on this, and we're excited to see where it goes.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You have been tuned in to the SPNN Forum, live from the Kwame McDonald studio at St. Paul Neighborhood Network. We have been in conversation with Keith Baker, Executive Director of Reconnect Rondo. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.